What's up, everyone? One of the goals that I had for this podcast was to provide a platform to folks who I felt were inspiring and impactful, or whose creative creations would be of interest to others. I wanted to shine light on their accomplishments and give them the recognition they deserved for their contributions to society. As I reflected more upon the types of people I wanted to give voice to, I realized how fortunate I was to be surrounded by so many successful women, particularly those in traditionally male-dominated fields. And so I decided to reach out to a few of them to see if they would be interested in coming on as guests to discuss their experiences as women in their respective professions. I wanted these fields to be ones that were important to me as well, and ones with which I've had my own degree of experience, and so I intended to explore writing, basketball, and craft beer. I was extremely grateful to receive yeses from my first two guests, but was shot down by the craft beer one for having paltry podcast statistics. It was then that I realized an unexpected but awesome coincidence, and what a wonderful opportunity this presented me in terms of that third spot. It just so happened that both of my guests were named Sarah, with an H, and so I decided to ask my daughter if she would like to be the third. She said yes, and so I'm really looking forward to speaking with her soon to complete the Sarah trifecta. It occurred to me, too, that each of the three Sarahs represents a different generation, and yet there are a lot of intangible commonalities between them, despite their various ages and professions. It also made me realize what I really wanted to get out of these first two interviews, and that was to champion these incredible women who were stalwart leaders, providing an incredible example for younger girls like my daughter. Both Sarah Key and Sarah Dessner have blazed trails for themselves in arenas that have been dominated historically by men, and which still, even today, provide unnecessary hurdles to women based solely upon their gender. In this, the first of my 3 Sarah-centric interviews, I got to speak with a woman who inspires me more than nearly anyone else. She is a South African author who hails from an area of the world that is rich with culture and rife with strife. Her purviews and perspectives are ones that I would argue most people should aspire to attain, and she is constantly reinventing herself, adding new experiences and taking on new challenges with unrivaled fearlessness. In short, when we tell our children, and our daughters in particular, that they can be anything that they want to be in life if they just put their minds to it and work hard enough, we are really speaking about someone like Sarah Key. She was kind enough to take time out of her day to speak with me about everything from the historical and present-day struggles in both her country and her continent, to the joys of raising daughters in the modern age, and, of course, writing. I've known Sarah for half a decade at this point, and I always enjoy getting to interact with her online. But this was an absolute thrill and a genuine pleasure to be able to speak with her over the phone for the first time. She is elegant and eloquent, sharp-witted and keenly perspicacious, and I hope that you enjoy listening to our conversation as much as I enjoyed participating in it. My guest today is a South African writer, artist, activist, mother, wife, and general inspiration. Miss Sarah Key, thank you so much for joining me today on the Mishmash podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me and for that rather great intro.
I know you first as a writer, but I've seen from your pictures on Facebook and your posts, you've done quite a number of different things in the arts. Is that correct?
I have. I think at the beginning of my career, I always wanted to be a teacher. So I did that first. I pursued English teaching. And then living in South Africa, being a young person in the mid-90s, it was an extremely exciting time. And I got into facilitating sort of life skills and doing a whole lot of work around HIV and AIDS and creating road shows and, working in the facilitation stakes, which was hugely exciting. I also was a lecturer at a polytechnic in life skills and communication skills. And then I went on to sort of delve into adult education on a greater level and got a master's degree in that and taught at our big university here, the University of the Witwatersrand. So that kept me busy. I suppose writing came out of about 15 years of other jobs. And just trying to create the academic rigor and learn to use the English language. And so I suppose it all evolved from the other skill sets that I worked on throughout my adult life.
And I feel like the best writing comes from experience. And it sounds like you have a wealth that you have been able to draw off of. And you had just mentioned earlier that you've branched off into a new direction, right? In terms of how you're spending your time these days.
I have. COVID was a very strange time for all of us, and I just sort of had time to pause. And our children are 17 and 19 now. I'm soon to be 53, and I seem to have had a 7 or 8 year itch in my career cycle. So I wrote. The last thing I did was write for a good chunk of time. For about 8 years, I wrote. But it's an incredibly, as we say as writers, don't give up your day job. So having explored various other things in COVID, like writing curricula for homeschooling, which also became a kind of a niche market here in that time, I looked at where I want to go, and I'm just sort of reassessing it. So strangely enough, at the moment, I run a ladies' fitness outdoor boot camp, which I've been part of for about 8 or 9 years. And our trainer has just immigrated. So I've taken that over. And then I have an 85-year-old mother who is generally very hale and hearty, but broke her hip in April. So I kind of feel
Oh, no.
she's up and about, though, threw away the Zimmer frame and is on her way. But I've always had an affinity for older folk. So at the moment, I'm just doing some part-time work, helping take old people out shopping, collecting them from hospitals if they need it, taking them to doctor's appointments. So that's actually also quite a strange turn of events before I kind of look at the direction I would like to pursue next.
And that's one of the things that I've found inspiring in our communications is your ability to adapt and just sort of go with the flow. I know the last few years in particular have been very difficult across the world, and you have handled that with aplomb. But I also know that you're someone who seems to be able to roll with the challenges and maybe the dark times without letting that negatively affect the good times. Like you seem to keep an even keel throughout, not getting too high or too low. Is that an accurate description?
Sorry, I'm having a bit of a thunderstorm. I think it is. I think that I'm a natural optimist, which is I'm very fortunate in that I also had a great childhood. I had a very happy childhood. I didn't experience any trauma when I was young. It was, I was stable. I always I was privileged. I got to do what I loved. I wanted to go and study drama and English, and my parents let me do that. So I've always been able to go with my strengths and with my passions, and as a result, be happy. So I do think that one needs to share the joy. Obviously, life is, there are up times and down times, but fortunately, I do kind of see the bright picture. And I also think it's important to develop resilience. Obviously, none of us are going to escape life without its sadness and its trauma, but I think, fortunately for me, I have a kind of disposition where I do tend to see the glass half full rather than half empty. And, there's a lot to be grateful for. So I try to kind of live by that. Obviously, no one's perfect, but I have my days too. But on the whole, I'm very grateful for what I have. And I try to celebrate everything that there is to celebrate in life.
From what I've seen of your daughter's work, is it just Annie or are both of your daughters artists and involved in painting?
No, it's just our younger one. So that's actually really quite thrilling because my maternal aunt, my only, maternal aunt, was actually a professional artist. So she was a Zambian, and she never ever left Zambia until she was an old lady and had to come to South Africa to be cared for. So she actually designed the Zambian stamps, and many of the assisted in designing the flag. And she was a wildlife artist, absolutely self-taught. She also worked for the Zambian government in the 60s and 70s, going around the world and setting up exhibitions for tourism. And I mean, she went through Checkpoint Charlie and she went to all kinds of extraordinary places. And she used to win these sort of double gold um, medals for these awards. And she'd take everything with her and set them up. So she actually got a member of the British Empire. So, I mean, she was a seriously good artist. And then it just kind of skipped everyone. I mean, my mother had a flair for color and a good eye. And, I could write, but I couldn't draw. And it's a wonderful thing now that our youngest child has now shown this great artistic ability. So she's busy taking art as a practical subject at school. I didn't initially think she was good enough. She wanted to do a portrait of a horse with my old mother and all her wrinkles. And I said, wow, that's a very difficult thing. I'm not sure if you'll be able to pull that off. But as one of our kind of women, I think she thought that was a challenge. And she's showing, great talent. But she's got another year of schooling, and then she's got to decide what she wants to do. She's also good on the science and maths side of things. And I said, well, if you look at your mother, and you will know that artists are, often starving people who struggle greatly. So perhaps it's something just to have as a good hobby rather than a living. So I think she's already realized that, it's very difficult to make it as an artist in the world, and particularly where we are. Our arts and culture minister has really dropped the ball in times of COVID, and our artists and performers and people like that have struggled and starved. I mean, it's actually really disgraceful. So I think she's already aware that although she has a talent and she's prepared to work very hard at it, there are other things in life that will perhaps bring you more stability and more constant economic return.
Right, but I'm sure she knows as well as you do that that's only an ancillary aspect to it, right? That it's really the creation itself that matters, and I think is what really drives and influences our various outlets, whether it's writing or painting. I can't imagine a better place to be a wildlife artist.
Yeah, so my aunt, she painted a lot of, I'm actually sitting here and I'm looking at her art as I speak to you. So a lot of landscapes, but then also the mammals of Southern Africa, the birds. She would work with entomologists. She would work with entomologists. I mean, she really was top notch. And yeah, from absolutely no training at all. And also sort of the most down to earth, normal kind of woman. Not my children like to tell me that I'm slightly eccentric, which I actually do not agree with to any degree. But my maternal aunt was also the most pragmatic woman. She had none of that sort of mad artist flair. She would just go into this very ordinary, rather scruffy studio that she had and paint, and she also wrote five books, 3 of them that were novels. So it is great to see, that things come through in the genes. And, I think like your children's love of basketball and things, it's quite extraordinary. I think it's just imprinted in the DNA there sometimes, these kind of passions and talents.
It's so funny that you say that because I never really considered it in terms of my own either strengths or passions or interests. I knew obviously my kids would be exposed to them, whether it was music or writing or basketball, but those were never things that I intended to force upon them. I know sometimes, parents do, they try to, live vicariously through their kids or make up for failed dreams or missed opportunities. And fortunately for me, I came into parenthood pretty satisfied and successful in terms of, the things I wanted to accomplish. And so I've never foisted any of those upon my kids. They came to basketball on their own and music, and the fact that it's something that we can share as a bonding point, I think is great. And to see them take those things that I loved as a kid and go so much further than I was able to is really exciting. And it's great to see with your daughter how it's almost like a legacy, right, at this point. And I feel like there is a legacy of strong women in your lineage. And that's part of why I wanted to bring you on and have a conversation with you, because I feel like in so many arenas, whether it's sports or the arts or whatever, there are still so many challenges that women face. And so as a writer, have you had any negative experiences or extra hurdles that you had to climb over as a woman in the arts?
I don't think so. I mean, it's an interesting thing, but I've never, perhaps it just is because, of that refusal to kind of not be treated equally. But I don't really feel that I've suffered from, behavior, inequality or sexism or chauvinism or anything like that. But having said that, I mean, in our society, we have an absolutely massive problem with gender-based violence. Annabelle was reading her life orientation textbook last night. It said, 1 in 4 men in South Africa has admitted to raping a woman. I mean, that just gives you a small idea of the scope of our kind of level of violence that we have in South Africa, perpetrated mostly men on women. I mean, that's my final novel that I've written deals with that in particular. But I think that women have an extremely raw deal in our country. We have a shocking amount of single mothers. We have a culture of fathers who take no responsibility for the children that they bring into the world. We therefore have a lot of young boys growing up with no male role models, and this just perpetuates this whole cycle. We have women who work menial jobs for nothing, who support their grown-up children, grown-up sons, grown-up, grandchildren as well. They, because of the patriarchal society and some of the customary beliefs, it's just extremely complicated. And women, African women, sure, they are strong women, and they bear, a heartbreaking amount on the whole. And we just don't seem to be able to get the spotlight on this issue and really make any kind of inroads into changing society in any meaningful way.
Right. And I think that in the United States, most people have maybe a passing, glancing knowledge of South African history, right? I think Nelson Mandela and apartheid, especially in the early 90s and late 80s, that's pretty much the extent of it. And so when folks here think of issues in South Africa, I think they think of it more along racial lines, but the gender inequity is just as prevalent, right?
Absolutely. And not only that, within the racial lines, there's a lot of tribalism. So there are a lot of different, we have 11 official languages. 9 of those are being African languages. So we also have different ethnic groups. And during the apartheid era, the part of the strategy of apartheid was also to divide Black people. So, for example, 2 of our great ethnic groups, the Sotho and the Zulu people, were also further pulled apart through conscious, engineering of factionism and things like that. So not only is society fragmented along race lines and along gender lines, but it's also fragmented along ethnic lines. So, it's an incredibly complicated history. And it was not, we did a few things to try and rectify the situation. We had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, but it didn't go anywhere near the level of conversation we needed to heal our fractured society, and also to look at issues of patriarchy and look at issues, many other deeper issues that really lots of narratives were required to even bring about, the beginnings of healing.
Right. And from what I've heard from other fellow writers in South Africa that I speak with, there's a lot of corruption in the government at not just the larger level, but even at the local level as well, which creates even more difficulties, correct?
Oh, look, we're going through an extremely torrid time as a country on the whole. The immigration is staggering. So if you look at Johannesburg, for example, and you look at estate agents and the amount of houses that are on the market, hasn't been seen in this kind of amount. And the reasons for that are because as you say, from every level, from the top down. Our previous president was, we got rid of him, and he's supposed to be in jail, but he is not in jail. But at a national and a provincial and a municipal level, we've had this corruption, just criminal corruption with no accountability. We have something called state capture. So on every level, corruption has sort of infiltrated to such a degree that even in COVID, protective clothing and information about companies put to give information out just defrauded us, in a time of a pandemic. We also have our national electricity supplier is completely incompetent, and we have endless, we didn't fix that in the apartheid era, but we haven't fixed it hence, to this day. So we experience something called load shedding, where we will not have power at scheduled times for up to 6 hours a day at the moment in a city like Johannesburg, which is the economic hub of Africa. So coupled with that, we have crippling crime, and we have a 42% unemployment problem. So, people here are very poor. They're very demoralized. It's not an easy place to live. Look, I don't know where it is. But the thing about people in South Africa is they have this resilient spirit. We have what Nelson Mandela talked about, which is Ubuntu. We have a spirit of rising up and of overcoming things that we've seen before, and that we actually have to continue to believe in. We have to continue to do acts of human kindness. We have to reach out to people. People who come here are quite blown away by the fact that everybody talks to everyone in a country like ours. Whether you're in the bank or you're at the supermarket or you just stopping your car at a traffic light, you'll have a chat with the next person. So we've got this very, very, special spirit, but we have so many social ills at the moment, and we have extreme poverty. We have a disparity of wealth between the rich and the poor. We have numerous problems, and problems that people are just not really willing to face anymore. They'd rather just get on the plane and go and live somewhere else. So it's distressing and it's heartbreaking, but I'm an African. I'm going nowhere. So we just, we live not forgetting the wonderful things that we have. We have the best weather in the world. Where I live on the Highveld here, we have sunny days about 300 days a year. We have beautiful rain. We have blue skies. We have a country that's extraordinary to travel in. But on the other side, we have other pretty terrifying and overwhelming problems, and a government that seems to have really let our people down.
Well, and see, that's one of the goals that I had with this podcast, was to shed light on the fact that the problems that we have here in the United States aren't unique to us. In fact, they're common, all too common. But one of the things that struck me about our interactions through the Facebook group that we met in, and my interactions with my friend Andre from Romania and others from elsewhere, is that I feel like for the few things that separate us, the differences, whether in our day-to-day lives or culture, philosophy, whatever it happens to be, there's so much more that unites us and so much more that we have in common. And unfortunately, these are negative things, but I take it as a heartening stance that the problems that we have here, the things that we're suffering with, people are suffering elsewhere as well, and they're fighting in the same way that we are. And you spoke about the South African spirit. That's something that I find incredibly inspiring because of those challenges. It's not just a recent thing. It's, decades, if not centuries of strife, and still the South African people persevere. And it's inspirational, especially in times like this, in what we're dealing with here in the United States. How do you feel that the road ahead is more hopeful now, looking, to the next few decades, or do you kind of think it's just on this even plane moving forward?
It's difficult to say, really, in terms of where we are as a country. It can leave you feeling less hopeful. But I think what we've all got to do as global citizens, exactly to pick up on what you said, is we need to develop resilience. and it is one thing that we need. If there's anything we give our children, it is to become resilient. But also, it's activism. It's actually standing up for those people who can't talk, doing something, saying social injustice is not okay. This is, and I think that it already, in my case, I feel, having two young women in our house, our elder daughter's beginning law now. She's in her first year of law. And it's fascinating to, just because she's been online mostly this year, to listen to what they're talking about. And, in a country like South Africa, it's also trying to find justice within customary law, within a complicated set of dynamics, with different belief structures. And I think that's the thing, it's pretty difficult to say that there's one solution for all situations. I think the depth and scope, obviously it's just dialogue, as we know, because we're people who love to dialogue and love to listen to other people's narratives. And I think that's what we've got to do. The more we share and the more we come together and the more we discuss possibilities, the more hope we have of closing these gaps and of empowering people who are, don't have a voice, and allowing those kind of messages to come out. But I think the world is, it's a tough place. And I think that because we have done so much, if you just look at climate, if you look at those kind of issues, and we just sort of, how long are we going to actually just ignore these problems? I think as humans, we only really start to pay attention when things are falling apart. We sit here without our lights on for 6 hours a day. Now we get to a stage where we're excited, where we actually do have electricity, and when we do have water, we feel grateful. But I think it's because we have neglected to value our resources and each other and our collective intelligence and our indigenous knowledge. And we have to stand up now and fundamentally change our behaviors.
I agree. And I think that perspective is what's important. Speaking just for the people here, I feel too often it's easy to lose sight of the things that we do have and focus on either the things that we don't or things that we want to be different. And having that perspective, being able to be happy within your means, being able to be satisfied with what you have, and working to change the things that you don't, is very different than just sitting back and complaining and inhabiting a negative mental perspective. And I've noticed with your writing, you're not afraid to speak about those really difficult topics. I know you've mentioned the violence that was featured in your books. You've covered a lot of other topics that are difficult to discuss, and you do so not just successfully, but with this raw emotional intensity. How has your experience as an African and a South African woman in particular influenced that in the novels that you've released?
Oh, hugely. So when I started writing, I was working. I was doing a national rollout with UNICEF and the university here, and I was traveling to all the provinces, and we were looking at how to assist child-headed households infected and affected by HIV and AIDS. So I went all over the country, and what was happening at that particular time was human trafficking. So that is how sort of my books start. They start on one particular social issue that keeps me up at night. And for the first book, it was human trafficking, because I used to look at, in the newspapers, I used to go to provinces and see reports of women who had disappeared. So that then became something that consumed me. At the same time, writing thrillers, one needs to have obviously page turning pace, and so the other social issues at that time were a drug addiction. I had an ex-boyfriend who became addicted to crack cocaine, and I'd sort of watched his devolution. And then there was the AIDS thing. So I obviously had to, at one stage, my editor said, please, can you stop? Can you just stop now? Can you just save these and put them in the next book? Because there were just so many issues that came up and that just got thrown into this book. It was very easy to write, but it was rather difficult to lose half of it and make it a tight tight, fast-paced thriller. But those were the issues that always drove the books. So that was one that, it continues. I mean, human trafficking is rife across the world, as you well know. And I mean, that's just the most horrifying kind of situation. But South Africa, once again, you've got all the different ethnic groups. You've got this rainbow of people that you can draw from. You've got the perfect, smorgasbord of characters that you can pull and pluck from. And very fortunately for me, in South Africa post-apartheid, you won't get slapped with, I think what you have to be quite careful of in America, if I'm correct, is cultural appropriation, which would just be horrific for me because, in my last book, I had about 20 Black characters and 3 white characters, and I'm writing as a white woman, So in another country, maybe in the US, people would say, how dare you, you can't do that. You may not write of these experiences. But because, I've worked so hard in so many different places and I've used almost ethnographic stories of people I've come across. I've worked extremely hard to make sure that they're authentic and that they are, I have beta readers, and I'm terrified because I'm aware of this whole sensitive nature around writing people who are different from yourself. But in South Africa, as writers, we're allowed to do that. We don't. No, I've yet touched wood. I've not had an experience where people said, "Oh, you can't write like that. How do you know? You're a white woman who lives in Sandton, not a woman who lives in a shack somewhere else." But because I've lived through so much in this country and I've been committed to finding out about other people's stories, I've had a huge amount to draw from, and I've been able to craft wonderful, exciting, extraordinary things, not only that from the characters, but also where the novels are set. So, I can travel from Zimbabwe, I can go to the coast, I can go to the desert, I can go to Cape Town, I can come to the big city here, and I can use the landscape as well as the cultural diversity just to come up with these great stories.
Life isn't one issue at a time, right? And so the fact that you are covering multiple things in a single book is really reflective of the human experience.
Oh, absolutely.
Just as a quick informational session for my listeners, we met through a Facebook group called Books and Everything. Are you still involved with that group by chance?
I'm not. Our gallant leader went off, and Andrew Christie, who is my great friend, he then went to do training and things. And I mean, he was the amazing person that sort of brought this whole thing to light and connected all these people. I mean, he got hold of me one day and said, "Oh yeah, I've been I've looked you up, and and I gather you're out and about, but you're writing these books that no one seems to read. What are you doing about it?" So I said, "No, I'm not too sure. What should I be doing about it? Shouldn't my American publisher be doing something about it?" He said, "Well, darling, if you think that, you're going to get nowhere." So he put me on a homework schedule and hounded me and kicked me and told me, "This is what you have to do, and this is the plan you have to come up with." And from there, we used to have those sessions that we all met each other on, Q&A sessions, and we met a host of amazing people. I'm still in communication with about 20 people from that group. So it was an absolutely wonderful group. But he's gone off and done other things. So I'm not too active on that group at all, although I am active on other book groups.
My introduction to that group came purely by chance. I had set up a book tour in 2017. And as an independent author, the problem is I have to supply my own wares.
Yes.
And so I was fortunate enough to have sold out of the first batch. I didn't want to order too much and have extra stock on hand. And so when I was forced to make the second order, I guess I got too much. And so I wound up with an excess at the end, and I wasn't really sure what to do with it. I could have just sat on them and, eventually sold them, but I found out about the Goodreads giveaway program. And
Yes,
so
yes, that was, yeah.
one of my silly dreams since I was a kid was to have my books read on every continent. And so the Goodreads giveaway gave me the opportunity to do that. I could specify which locale I wanted it to go to. And so I was able to do that. And Andrew wound up being the winner from South Africa for my African giveaway. And it was really funny because I sent out the book, everything was fine. And a few weeks later, I got a message from Goodreads informing me that there was a complaint. I said, complaint? Uh-oh. I didn't know what happened. And it turns out that Andrew said that he had never received the book. And so we weren't, they were very explicit that we were not supposed to communicate directly with the winners. And I get it. It's because, they don't want us to influence, potential reviews or ratings and whatnot. But I guess this was a sanctioned communication. And so, I sent him the proof, the receipt and whatnot. And I think it turned out that he had just forgotten to go to the post office to check his mail, and it had been sitting there for a while, which I'm guessing from the last.
I'm sure that could be.
That sounds about right. And so a few weeks after that, he reached out again about joining the group. And of course, I was skeptical at first because it was, an email request, and I wasn't sure, but my gut told me that it was something good. And it was such a great surprise because I was able to interact with so many phenomenal writers and just great people in general. Out of everyone, your work and your just personality resonated the most with me. But I really enjoyed the poetry from Rashida Khan.
Yeah, a whole lot. Yeah, I'm still, I still have lots of buddies from that group. So it was great. It was really great. But I mean, as you know, writing the book's the easy part.
That's true.
It's what you have to do with the rest of it, and as an indie, it's, I was my first 4 books were published by an American publishing house, but they very generously gave me the book blocks. And then I sort of acted as an independent writer here. So I would get my print runs done. And then it's the same thing, many book fairs, many pushes, and Andrew was always very against putting your book in getting a distributor and putting your book in a bookshop. Because, as South African authors, you make about 12 Rand. I don't even think that's $1. In fact, it isn't even $1.
Oh, wow.
Off a book you sell in a bookshop. So, by the time everyone's taken their cuts of your books. So he was, if you could sell your book clean out of pocket, you could make a good profit. But here, the book, well, I'm sure it's the same everywhere, It's very difficult to make a living out of writing.
Right. Well, I know for me.
Do you agree?
Absolutely. And for me too, I had an interest in getting a traditional publishing contract, and I mistakenly thought that writing a series would somehow make it more marketable, not realizing that if you can't sell a potential agent on one book, you're definitely not going to be able to sell them on 4 or 5.
It's true. Yeah, my trilogy also, But, at least we have our provenance. We've done our work now. We've got these books. They will stand there as our legacy. And that's not, everyone says to you, so is it easy to write a book? Or I want to write a book. What advice can you give me? And I always say, think very carefully,
Right.
I always ask them, are you a bit of a sadomasochist? Because if the answer is no, you're not going to make it, dear, It's a tough thing to do.
Right.
It really is.
And
but
being a writer is more about being a marketer in the modern era, more so than ever before. But it's also a consequence of the changes, right? In, I would say, the early 2000s, there was a black mark on you if you went the self-publishing route. There was like no hope at that point of getting a professional. Right. There was a stigma associated with it. And now that's largely gone away, but the problem is that the market is oversaturated with material.
Yes, exactly. And I think also indies, they often don't pay enough to get their books adequately edited, and so there is a lot of junk out there.
Yeah. You said that you had a background in teaching English education, and I did as well. And I think that's sort of a vetting process of sorts. We've learned how to write. We've had more importantly, we've had our writing critiqued by professionals, whether it's professors or other writers who've done it before us. And like you said, too many of the independent writers now don't go through that process. Specifically, will avoid it. They won't get beta readers, or they will ignore whatever their readers tell them in terms of feedback. And it's created a difficult situation for writers who want to and maybe are more deserving just based on the merits of their writing alone of being recognized and noticed. But it's just another challenge.
I think also you need a bit of money, because you need to pay someone to do this. But when you're an indie and you're not making any money off your writing, you have nothing to plow back into. So even, independent writers who want to do it are often in a position where financially they just can't afford to.
Absolutely. And for me, the decision to remain an independent author, for now at least, was more on creative control. I wasn't worried about an editor telling me to rewrite the story or to change this or that. It was more, I realized I enjoyed every aspect of it, designing the cover, the layout, just everything about it. And then the marketing as well. I enjoy, gaining new skills or enhancing ones that I've had. And so developing, trailers for the books or coming up with innovative ideas to market whatever I'm working on at the time is a valuable experience for me. And it feeds back on itself. It helps me become a better writer because I'm looking at things from different angles that maybe a published author or just someone who's not as interested in the full scope of it would have access to.
No, you're just too damn smart and you're showing off now. See?
Well, that could definitely be part of it. Well, it's funny because you mentioned your daughter being skilled in both the arts and math, and that was always I never really appreciated the fact that I had the best of both worlds. Like my first job teaching was actually we have the SAT exam, which is basically a college entrance exam. And so I was able to tutor both the math side and the reading side, which was great because I had a natural knack for both, for words and for numbers. And I didn't realize at the time that wasn't a common thing. Especially most of the math-oriented people that I know don't like they don't like to write, or they're not interested in that aspect of it. And especially the flip side is true, where a lot of my creative friends they say they don't have a head for numbers. And I've always hated that type of mentality, because that more often than not, people who say that either struggled with math because they didn't have the right teacher, or they had a teacher who told them flat out that they were bad at math. And that kills me. I think everybody can learn math and science and things of that nature. They just may need to learn it in a different way, right? Or have it come from a different angle.
Do you mind if I just stick with the words?
Yeah.
No, I think that left brain, right brain thing is a fabulous thing to have. And I think, a lot more, interestingly enough, I was reading an article about why musicians and creatives, don't make, you can't keep their money. They may amass a fortune, but many of them just go through their money and die penniless and things. And I think it is to do with that, is that for whatever reason, and some of them that you state, I do think hold some validity. But, it is a fact that a lot of creatives are not very good. And if you just look at how they mismanage their funds, for example, and their life, their economics, it's actually quite tragic.
Right. And I mean, and that speaks to it as well, right? There are plenty of writers who want to write only. They don't necessarily have a head for marketing. And that's not something that I take for granted either. I went to school for finance, and I had the full, business background experience, accounting, finance, marketing, all of it. And so that definitely influences the decisions that I make. And I think it gives me the opportunity, again, to come to things from a different perspective, and understand maybe a little bit more about, what goes on. I don't know how active you are on Twitter, but I'm part of something on there called the Writing Community. And it's like a diluted version of Books and Everything. And I've noticed that there are so many people who are marketing their books or getting frustrated because they feel like they're marketing their books on there, but they don't realize that they're just marketing them to other writers. They're not trying to build readers. And so it's, again, I do feel for the folks who don't necessarily have a strength in terms of a business acumen, because you really do, if you want to be, a financially solvent writer, you need to have that as a skill set. And it's a steep learning curve, I can tell you that.
It is indeed. And also, just writing whatever's in vogue. I mean, a while ago, it was sort of erotica was huge. And then it was now, romance. Looking at genres and actually writing according to genres is probably a sensible way to start. But, I just never did that as a writer. I just had these stories that wouldn't leave me and wrote them.
Well,
So,
well, I'm glad you said that because that's another reason why I've enjoyed the indie route because I've wanted to write stories. The first thing I tell people is it might not be for you and that's okay. I'm not writing it for anybody but myself. And that was a really early lesson that I learned and one that I'm incredibly grateful for because it made me much happier with the process and it opened up the creative floodgates, if you will, because I wasn't concerned or preoccupied with, oh, will this be commercially successful? Will this appeal to people?
exactly.
And so
Exactly.
at the end of the day, and the funny thing is, the proudest moment I've had as a writer was when my oldest son was finally old enough to read my books and he loved them. And they are definitely not kids' books. They're not written in a way that, would necessarily appeal to an adolescent. And so for him to have gotten what he got out of it was great. And I remember, I think it was my daughter who wrote that I was her favorite author for like a school paper or something. And those experiences are things I never anticipated having, as a result of writing. And those are the things I cherish and value the most.
Yeah, that's very special.
You mentioned earlier about cultural appropriation, and I think the reason why you are so successful in your writing and why it's so appealing, at least to me, is it's authentic, right? There's authenticity in your word. It's coming from a genuine place. And I think when that becomes an issue here, whether it's in acting or writing or whatever it happens to be, it's because the person that is engaging in the appropriation is doing so for inauthentic reasons, right? Like they don't understand the underlying aspects, let's say, of the culture or whatever it is that they're going for. And I think as a writer, and you specifically as a writer, we are constantly absorbing and assessing details from the world around us. And I think that puts us in a position where if we feel that urge to write about something, we're doing so from an experienced position, but maybe not the same vantage point as someone who's lived it firsthand. And I think that enables us to write about those things, even if that's not our personal experience. Would you agree?
I would, but still, it's quite a nerve-wracking thing, and you've got to work very hard at it, because you understand that it is loaded, and it might be something that someone takes offense to. So it takes hard work and it takes courage and also using tools like ethnographic. For example, in Tangled Weeds, my first book, there's a story of a boy who goes up a mountain for his initiation. And that is actually my friend's personal story of what happened up there, because that's also shrouded in secrecy and not really allowed to be discussed. So for those kind of stories, I'm very grateful, and I recognize how valuable they are, and that you have to overcome a lot to be prepared to share those stories. So it's a very sensitive issue. But, I also think in South Africa, there's just so much taboo around so many things. And just things are shrouded in secrecy, and that is maintained through power and control and fear. You're told if you tell this will happen and that will happen, and I just don't think people should be controlled by fear. So that's why I feel it's important to tell those stories in a very sensitive manner.
What I love about writing is creating this, what I consider meaningful content, right? Like I put a lot of effort into giving it depth, and it's frustrating because I'll see, the top of the New York Times bestseller list is some memoir from a celebrity.
Yeah.
It's almost like junk food is the way I think of it. And it's not just limited to writing. It's, whether it's movies or music, and it's sort of chasing that zeitgeist for the sake of
Yeah.
trying to remain relevant. And so I appreciate
Yeah.
writing like yours and Rashida Khan's and other authors who I've interacted with who don't worry about that. Like it's the focus is still on the authenticity of it and creating something for the sake of creating it. And that's the one thing that I don't think people understand about writing is they'll say, well, where do you get your ideas from? And it's not a conscious thing. It's something that develops inside of us, and it's a need to get it out, at least in my experience.
No, absolutely. And I don't think if it's very difficult to complete if you don't have that drive from within you pushing you forward.
And I know for me, as trite as it might sound, the best writing that I've done, it told itself. Like I do like to have plot, layouts and just notes to refer to, really just as a way to keep everything moving forward. But I've learned to shut up and listen when the story begins to sort of take a life of its own and lead, even if it leads me in a completely different direction than I was anticipating. And I mean, you really can't express that to someone who's never experienced it,
Yeah, I'm terrible. I'm a complete pantser. I don't know how things are going to work out. And by 3/4 of the way through the book, I'm nearly jumping off a tall building because I'm thinking, wow, look where I have got myself. How am I going to figure this one out? But then your characters tell you. And also they behave in a way that's appropriate to their own personality. So they go and do things, because that is what they would choose. And so it's a muddle, but it's an exciting process. So,
right. And that's the thing. Like, I hope that my stories resonate with people or that they find something of interest in them. But again, it's not like it's something I take personally because, again, in certain instances, the characters write themselves. They may be born in my mind, but they sort of exist unto themselves on the page. And that's the thing. Like, I think the best writing is sort of a pantser mentality versus a plotter or plotzer, because it's too rigid otherwise. If you dictate every single aspect of your story, it's going to be stale and stiff. Whereas if you just sort of allow it and let it be free flowing, you'll wind up reaching the end of the journey, right? And I think it's a much richer experience for it.
I think so. You could probably save quite a bit of time, though, if you plotted a bit more carefully.
Right.
But then,
absolutely.
As writers, we have a lot of time, don't we? No, but I know commercial writers who are churning out really good stuff, and they work extremely hard. But they have every detail of the plot down. So I always said, if I could have a bit more of that. But it's just not the way. It's not my creative process at all. I just can't do it.